It's agreement to disagree. Do you agree?
I don't agree. I think there are agreements and a strong willingness from both sides to manage the risks. And in fact, I was a member of the PRA delegation to Pentagon for the negotiation of the two MOUs last year. The negotiations went smoothly, and it took only 3 or 4 days for the both sides to reach the agreement. And also, in the two MOUs, there is the main part, it tells the principles and the departments in charge and how to negotiate, how to view what both militaries have done, but also there are annexes. So it is an open system, and annexes can be added anytime. I think that is great. And this year, 2 annexes are added.
But on the other hand, will these kind of MOUs, will these kind of mill-to-mill relation and exchanges really help us to avoid possible crisis, Professor Langton? This is the thing that we really have to think about these days.
Well, I think one question is the one you asked, how will it help us avoid crises? And I think the answer is yes. But there's another thing to say, how important it is to avoid crises. Think back to April of 2001, and we had the unfortunate collision between the American surveillance aircraft and the Chinese jet fighter. That involved, it took about, as I recall, 12 days to resolve that, just to get the American service personnel back. It took a long subsequent negotiation to get our aircraft back. It left many bruised feelings in both countries.
To say the least.
Right, to say the least. And I think the current environment of distrust, we've made progress in some ways, but the level of distrust is still high. If we had such an incident today, I think it would be more difficult to contain. So I think this kind of agreement is more important than ever. And also, China has more aircraft to move to that area. The U.S. has its rebalancing. So over time, we're going to find more military units and aircraft and naval vessels in closer proximity to each other, and just the pure mathematics means the opportunity for a mistake is greater and the consequences will be greater. So I very much agree with Senior Colonel Zhou that no, this won't solve all problems. People still will make mistakes. But this reduces the odds, and it perhaps provides us a way to manage what difficulties will come after such an accident.
I'm not sure the next question you would necessarily agree with one another, so let me ask the next question. The U.S. Defense Secretary, Mr. Carter, had been saying just over the past few days that the United States is ready to fly, sail, and operate in areas which he said, as long as international rules allow. And of course, those areas include what China believes as its own territory. So here's the thing. One is to try to have mechanisms and principles to avoid any crisis. The other is to have tendency of actions to create crisis. So how should we understand the roles of the military in this regard?
Well, first of all, the military is responsive in both our countries, I believe, to civilian direction. So this is a political question, and the militaries are instruments of civilian control. So this isn't really a military question, this is a political question. And of course, our Secretary of Defense is a civilian, not a military person. So that's the first thing. Secondly, you started your question by saying the United States and China have different understandings. That's true in some respects, but frankly, it's not true in other respects. We'll just point out President Obama was just in Alaska, and the Chinese military sent some ships into the waters of the United States. And the United States may or may not have been happy with that, but we never challenged to the right of China to sail into those waters, and China felt free to do so. Similarly, with respect to Diaoyu Senkaku business, China challenges the claims of Japan there by penetrating from time to time, either on the sea or in the air, those lines. So I think it's really just a question. In one case, China finds the activities to be undesirable, and in other cases, it feels free to use the rules so I think we actually understand what's going on.
All right. Senior Colonel Zhao, your analysis and also reaction to the arguments presented by Professor Langton earlier.
The Chinese are very sensitive about U.S. military activities along its coastline. A couple of years ago, we raised the 3 barriers for the mirror-to-mirror relationship. One is U.S. arms sale to Taiwan, and the second, that is U.S. aircraft, reconnaissance aircraft, and the reconnaissance ships, frequently patrolling along China's coastline. And the third is your NADD 2000, which restricted 12 areas for mirror-to-mirror relationship between China and the U.S. And also from that year, according to NDAA, that year, the U.S. published a China military report every year until now. Especially, for the reconnaissance aircraft and the reconnaissance, ships movement in this area. If a country is frequently, threatened by all the military activities along its coastline, and it will have a strong sense of insecurity. And so, under this context, Secretary Carter declared the U.S. military is ready to patrol in 12 nautical miles of China's islands. So I think that is aggressive, a threat, action to China's sovereignty, security. I think everybody should agree with this. Professor Langton said Mr. Carter is a civilian. That's true, but he is the Secretary of U.S. The Defense Department. He is the boss of the U.S. military, and all the actions by the U.S. military is made by himself.
No, actually, the President of the United States is his boss.
Okay. He's the primary aide of President.
Yeah.
The political structure, of course, is interesting. Both U.S. and China talked about this UNCLOS, but U.S. is not a signatory yet to this UNCLOS. Professor Langton, how do you understand the complicated role that U.S. now is putting itself in terms of using the UNCLOS and yet not really part of the UNCLOS?
Well, I think it is a contradiction. I think it's not a desirable contradiction. I wish the Senate of the United States, which has to approve this, would do so. I think it hampers our foreign policy because they did not do so. But the president has said, nonetheless, we will observe it. That's all the president can do unless the Senate approves. So I would say we have a problem, but broadly speaking, the United States adheres to it because the President of the United States said the executive branch, which is the agency governing our actions, we will adhere to it. And I think we have. I'm not an international lawyer, but I believe we generally have. So I think it's unfortunate. I also agree with Senior Colonel Zhao that the National Defense Authorization Act of 2000 is in many respects unfortunate. But this is the problem when you have a government that has 3 branches.
But the thing is, Professor Langton, the issue is all about action and reaction.
Right.
And escalation of actions and reactions. Escalation of rhetorics and reactions to the rhetorics.
I think we have 2 reasonable points of view here. One is that legally, under law, you're entitled to do certain things. what the Chinese side, Senior Colonel Zhou, and I think all other Chinese I've talked to, find nonetheless that us doing close-in surveillance frequently is increasing insecurity and undesirable from a Chinese point of view. I understand that. I would hope over time we can get enough confidence where we reduce what we're doing to the absolute minimum. Now, I don't have the
you don't give
secret
command to the
I
US
don't have
Navy.
the concrete information to say the frequency, but I would hope we would do it, the absolute minimum and reduce Chinese insecurity. I can understand that. Many Americans were concerned when PLA naval ships went in the Bering Straits up by Alaska. So I think we can understand that. We should do as much as we can, as rapidly as we can, to increase confidence so we can feel secure ourselves.
On the other hand, Senior Colonel Zhao, from China's perspective, there are certain things many say also can be done. Recently, we've been hearing from senior officials from China's PLA talking about China is not going to recklessly resort to military action, even when it comes to territorial disputes.
Yep.
This is a big debate inside this country.
Yep.
And also, China talking about building the lighthouses in some of the Nansha Islands to serve for navigation guidance of passing ships rather than militarizing islands. But others suggest China has to back its rhetoric with actions.
I think the Chinese government has done a lot to reduce the tensions in the South China Sea. That's true. Over the past month, China has done some constructions on the islands in Nansha Island. The islands are occupied and claimed and occupied by China. From the China's perspective, nothing wrong. The islands are claimed by China and are controlled by China, and we have done some constructions that are legal, that are justified, that are reasonable. And since it has raised some concerns of the neighboring countries and from the United States, and the Chinese government said it is only used for civilian purpose, and China is ready to provide public goods to neighboring countries and for this region. You see, under this context, I think the United States should be careful. If the US is ready to send military ships or aircraft inside the 12 nautical miles under the name of the freedom of navigation, I think it will put China in a very difficult and dilemma, situation. Should we fight or not? If we fight, you see, we have done so much to reduce misunderstanding, miscalculation, try to avoid escalation of the tension. All this will fail. And the bilateral relationship between China and the US, will be back in 10 or 20 years. And if we do nothing, the Chinese government will be criticized much by the Chinese themselves. So I think the United States should be careful when they made the decision.
Professor Langton?
Well, first of all, China's not the only country with public opinion. The United States has public opinion. We've been a long-term naval power. And it seems to us that international law is quite clear. So if, with respect to what is an island and what is not an island, and things that are not islands don't get 12 miles. That's our view. And if President Obama has already been criticized for not being, in the view of some Americans, tough enough, perhaps in Syria, other things like that, with respect to the Russians, Ukraine, and Crimea. So our system also has public opinion, and the problem is that our politicians often get us into places where then the public is demanding things they really don't want to do because it's going to be very bad for relations. But it's not only China's public opinion or our public opinion. The Filipinos have a public opinion. The Vietnamese have public opinion. And I was quite impressed with General Fan Changlong's statement yesterday at the Shangshan Forum about not recklessly using force. I was also quite favorably impressed by his mention of how China solved its land border issues. I thought that was very constructive. So everybody's got public opinion. It's the job of leaders to manage public opinion.
Has that job been done very well inside the United States? At least to the Capitol Hill, for example?
No, I don't think so.
Professor Langton talking about some of the previous practices, but does territorial disputes could only be resolved by compromises? Right. Particularly, a compromise has to be done by a bigger country, relatively speaking, to a smaller country, regardless of what the principle of fairness is. Particularly, fairness could be explained in so many different ways.
I think China is ready to compromise because we know that is the only way for we to successfully resolve the disputes. And what we are concerned about is, the external powers. For example, the United States getting involved and make the situation, more complicated, more complex, to be resolved.
Well, first of all, I agree with much of what was just said. I don't think we've intended to make things more difficult, but as I said, many of the smaller countries find it in their interest to involve us. So there's this dynamic of smaller powers trying to bring in bigger brothers to.
They were sailing with the wind of pivot to Asia, coming from the United States, though.
But the thing I would say is I think the United States should be flexible in two regards. We've placed thus far the emphasis on multilateral resolution of this problem. If that can work in certain areas, that's certainly fine with me. But if China could deal bilaterally in cases where bilaterally works, fine, I agree. China was very flexible on its land borders. I would say, in many cases, generous with the other party. And the United States should be willing to both accept either multilateral or bilateral, whatever works. And we ought to be willing to encourage our friends to accept a reasonable deal.
Well, it seems that we have solved everything today through our discussion. But of course, the reality is much more complicated than just on the picture or just through words. We are looking forward to some real resolutions. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for the two of you for coming over to World Insight and share your insights with us. Very generous of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.